Welcome to 502 Conversations. I'm Brian Kirby, and my guest today is Bernie Garrett, professor at the University of British Columbia School of Nursing with over 35 years of experience in both critical care nursing and nursing education. Dr. Garrett, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good, and I'm coming to you here from British Columbia today.
So are you in Vancouver? Is it right?
I'm actually, based in Vancouver. That's correct.
All right, well, this is modern, amazing technology, I must say, because as you know, I'm just outside of Boston here. So I do have a proper bio on you. I will read that, and then we shall get right at it. Dr. Garrett is a registered nurse and holds a PhD in information science and has a number of specialist clinical and educational qualifications. Dr. Garrett has authored several science and clinical textbooks, chapters in edited books, and numerous research papers. His research falls into two arenas: deception in healthcare products and services, including alternative medicine, and second, the use of new immersive media technologies in healthcare applications, such as virtual reality for pain management. His work is underpinned by a passion for health science and technology, and he holds provincial and national awards for his work in furthering nursing education. Bernie Garrett is an inaugural fellow of the Canadian Nurse Educator Institute and author of The New Alchemists, The Rise of Deceptive Healthcare, about which we will talk today. All right, Dr. Garrett, thank you so much for being here. With dozens of scholarly articles and book chapters, why did you write this book for the public?
Well, I had a particular interest over the years in health scams and health deception, as I've seen a huge amount of it during my career, and particularly the psychology of why people engage in it. So I was interested in exploring that. And sort of later in my career, I got the opportunity to start research in this area. So I started working with some other researchers, such as Timothy Caulfield from the University of Alberta, and ended up sort of focusing on some of these particularly egregious issues that come up with healthcare marketing.
I think most people know alchemy. It's turning lead into gold is the most popular form of it. There are others. But what is health alchemy?
Well, it's an interesting one. When we came up with the title for the book, we were looking at ways to sort of explain what was happening. And as most people know, alchemists are best known for trying to turn metal into gold, and sought also, less people know this, to develop immortality potions. And in 1404, King Henry outlawed alchemy in the United Kingdom, and it seemed a useful analogy to what we see happening in modern healthcare today and wellness industry, where we see a lot of people trying to basically market various snake oil remedies and potions, and including the pharmaceutical industry, and engaging in deception. To sort of prolong people's life, or as they claim, to try and encourage people to live longer and be more healthy.
So then, define deceptive healthcare, maybe with some examples.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Deception's an interesting one, because deception can be regarded as a form of communication between two or more individuals who one is a deceiver and one is the deceived in psychological terms. And where there's a distortion or omission of particular information by the deceiver, which serves to misrepresent something for the primary benefit of them. It can take one of two forms, really. In healthcare, we see one where the deceiver is aware of the deception and they're deliberately, basically, trying to fool someone. But others where they're not, where they don't really care about whether they're right or wrong, but their objective is simply to get their point across or make money or what. And this is something, it's an interesting researcher called Professor Harry Frankfurt, who went as far as to suggest there's a distinction between this form of self-deception observed particularly in science and academia, which works well here, which he fittingly described as bullshit. In other words, he argues it's where the person is indifferent to the difference between truth and falsehood, as long as their position is supported.
We'll come back to that, because there's also some self-deception involved, perhaps, too, on the part of the practitioners. So we'll come back in a minute. But so that's deception, it's alchemy. What is alternative medicine? I think people instinctively know what alternative medicine is just by example, but if you take it apart, alternative medicine, what does that mean?
Well, it's something we've done fair bit of research on in terms of understanding what people mean by it, and the problem with it is it has various different terms. Yeah, as you say, most members of the public will have an idea of what alternative medicine is, but it has been possibly somewhat negatively described as, the opposite of medicine. It's not medicine, but what we can really say is it's medicine that comes out of traditions that aren't based in science or biomedical science, and so it often involves faith-based practices rather than evidence-based or scientific practices.
So it would be an alternative to science-based medicine then.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a bit problematic because there is some traditional medicine that has moved into becoming evidence-based and science-based medicine. But there's also a lot more out there that is not based on science and is purely based on faith or religious ideas or spiritual ideas that aren't necessarily supported by science.
So let's talk about that a little bit. So alternative medicine, or I guess some folk remedies, or I don't know. I think you give a good example of aspirin coming from willow tree, right? So it's observed to work, and then to become evidence based, it's put to trials, and we actually do some scientific testing on it. That's what moves alternative medicine into the medicine category.
Well, in some cases that has happened, but the problem is a lot of cases it isn't. And one of the major issues which I tackle in the book is medicine is complex basically because it deals with human psychology. It's not like physics or chemistry where we can do experiments with very specific quantities that can be interpreted without the input of psychology. But humans are notoriously, prone to uh, basically making errors of judgment and also to sort of do things where they think something is correct when it may not be correct. And so we find with a lot of alternative medicine, it is based on belief and psychology, particularly two things. One we'd call the placebo effect, which I'm sure you and your viewers are familiar with, but also something called regression to the mean, where we have, for example, people tending to get better on their in naturally through the disease process rather than as a result of a particular intervention. So all of these things together can mean that people are particularly prone to believing something works when it doesn't.
All right, let's back up a little bit because you mentioned we've talked about evidence-based and science-based evidence. So you do have a section on that. So let's talk a little bit about that just to lay some groundwork. So evidence-based practice means good scientific evidence, right? So, or science-based best evidence. I think that's what you write. But not all evidence is science-based. And with alternative medicine and supplements, I mean, we hear things like this is evidence-based, or it's scientifically studied, or it's clinically tested. What's the difference between this generic evidence-based phrasing and science-based best evidence, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, it's a tricky area, and of course, it is an actual subject that has come in for a lot of conflict, particularly between alternative practitioners and some medical practitioners as well. So it arose from work of a doctor called Dr. Archie Cochrane in the 1970s, who was a UK Scottish, actually, I should say, physician who was interested in how practice in hospitals was, often based on expert opinion, not necessarily on good evidence. For example, you may have two doctors who have very different care protocols for the same condition working in the same hospital. And so he sought basically to see how we could resolve them and improve healthcare so it was better based. So it's moved on since there in a lot, but we do have a hierarchy of evidence. And at the bottom is actually expert opinion. So if we think, the least credible evidence we've got is someone's opinion. At the top of it, and in the middle, we have things like randomized controlled trials where we do experiments with drugs, which have to be done before drugs are approved. to make sure they're safe and they work. And then at the very top, we have these what we call meta studies, where we have, for example, the results of lots of different studies all put together to compare and to see, what the result overall is. A huge amount of studies. So we have a degree of confidence that we may have in a particular intervention, a drug or a therapy, from a very low level of evidence to a high level of evidence. So, for example, things like aspirin and other sort of common pharmaceuticals that we get, we've got got a huge history of that, lots of trials, lots of evidence in practice, so we can be confident how they work and that they're safe and they do work. At the bottom end, we can just have expert opinion. And this is where a lot of the wellness industry works. Nutraceuticals particularly are problematic in this area. And unfortunately, a lot of alternative medicine is in this area as well.
Speaking about the hierarchy of evidence, I think one of the things in your book is you wrote that there's an inverse relationship between alternative medicine and its effectiveness, meaning that as research shows it really isn't effective, it seems that alternative medicine is on the rise. So the evidence is going one way, down, but the popularity is going up. So is that a case of popularity over evidence, or just great marketing, or distrust of true expertise and true evidence?
Yeah, it's a really interesting phenomenon, and basically it's a combination of things. So, let's take an example with homeopathy. Now, you can go in your local pharmaceutical drugstore and you'll find homeopathic remedies on sale in there. And if you look on the web, there's loads of sites that are promoting them, and they're quite popular. However, the evidence is very clear that they didn't do anything and they do not work. And yet we have very powerful marketing, very powerful companies, multi-million dollar companies manufacturing and marketing these products, and they have a vested interest in selling them. So because of course the evidence is showing, well, they don't actually do anything, and even the theoretical evidence behind them suggests that it'd be impossible for them to work. They rely on basically very low levels of evidence, which would be personal testimony, for example, experts saying they do work, and these sort of social media marketing to sell their products, because obviously it's not in their interest, in their business, for these products not to be sold, because they'll lose money. So hence, these are very powerful techniques, and with the advent of social media now, they're being used more prevalently to market a whole range of things with very little control over advertising. So we do see their profits actually going up and their popularity going up simply due to popularism and marketing.
We'll come back to homeopathy and dressing things up like medicine, because if you go to the CVS or whatever your local store is, they're right next to medicine,
yeah,
in similar looking bottles.
But same here, yeah.
But before we go down that road and some specific examples, there was something interesting also in your book I read about the statistic that 37% of Americans believe that the FDA is influenced by the pharmaceutical industry to deliberately suppress natural cures. Okay, so that's not just like a pharmaceutical company may have their hands in trying to influence the outcome of a decision or something. People literally believe that they are suppressing natural cures. Okay, I don't know why I can't say cures, but thinking that they're suppressing natural cures, that is conspiratorial thinking, right? So that has to have an effect on the rise of deceptive healthcare.
Absolutely, and we have a very great case at the moment of somebody who's being appointed by your new president in the healthcare. Mr. Kennedy, who has a history of conspirational, I can't say it now, conspiracy thinking as well. Well, we're suggesting that vaccines, for example, were targeted against specific members of the population. But the problem is, people have a distrust of the pharmaceutical industry for very good reason. The pharmaceutical industry has sort of shot itself in the foot over the years with various sort of activities that have been designed to make them profits rather than, for the benefit of humans and humankind. We have, for example, the OxyContin opioid crisis with the overprescription and marketing of that drug, which we all know led to millions of people with addictions and problems there. We have Praxil and Wellbutrin, antidepressants that were marketed withholding the fact that they increased the risk of diabetes. We had Vioxx as well, which increased the risk of heart attack, which was marketed. And there's various other ones as well that we can look back in the track record of the pharmaceutical industry with particularly price fixing, off-label marketing practices that have been widespread, and they've been fined for these and lost court cases in numerous instances. So really, this has led to a distrust, and hence the conspiracy view that we do see these pharmaceutical multi-billion dollar industries actually having influence, and so it's understandable.
I apologize for somehow magically transferring my mild speech impediment to you. My mild speech impediment for today, anyway. I don't know what's going on. But it's interesting because, yeah, there have been issues and fines, but there's been so much good work too. But, the bad news gets all the press. But also, if there were some natural cure for if there were some natural cure for diabetes or something, that's big money too for whoever starts marketing it. So it's not like a pharmaceutical company that would suppress that. That would be huge.
Well, exactly, and I mean that's it. A lot of these bad press happened over sort of the end of the last century, and they have cleaned up their acts a lot because obviously it's important for them to do that. But a lot of this is based on an appeal to what we call the naturalistic fallacy. This idea that natural is better. And it's a well-known logical fallacy, often used to refer to the claim that what is natural is inherently good and what is unnatural is inherently bad. So interestingly, this has been the basis for a lot of the marketing of wellness remedies and alternative health. And we know that this is not necessarily the case. There's plenty of natural things that are lethal and particularly bad for us. But they use that in their marketing, and therefore this idea that natural remedies are better is basically one of the key ingredients of a lot of marketing of deceptive healthcare.
We'll get into some specifics in just one second, but I wanted to ask you, first of all, we can all be susceptible to being deceived. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But are there any demographics that make one more susceptible, such as, I don't know, male, female, or how old you are, your education, economic status, or what your health actually is?
Yeah, well, we've done some research on that, and we actually looked at a study we did back in 2017 and 2018 about how internet health scams and who's being susceptible to them. And we tended to find that a lot of people who engage with them, they're very often targeted at women and adolescents, because particularly a lot of them are, if we think about the way society works, women are often involved more in the caring roles than the men are, so they're particularly targeted at them. Adolescents are very concerned with body image, and obviously, so there's a lot of targeting of those particular products, for example, skincare products, anti-acne products, that sort of thing at that age group. And of course, young adolescents and younger adults as well, with body image, such as bodybuilding, type of activities we see. And also, a lot of it is marketed over the web with web-based media. And of course, that generally targets younger population as well. So we do see that those are the main areas that are targeted by that. Also, interestingly, they're targeted at people with money. So they are generally targeted at fairly well-educated people in what we might call, the upper middle classes who have disposable income to actually spend on these sorts of remedies.
All right, let's get into some specifics here. You've mentioned homeopathy, so let's talk about that. And I'm going to bring up a few specifics that I kind of call the Wizard of Oz alternative medicines, and that is they're dressed up pretty good, but if you pull back the curtain and figure out what's going on, it's a totally different look. And homeopathy, I think, is perhaps the easiest to explain, right? So what is homeopathy?
Well, we could spend an hour talking about it, but in a nutshell, it is the idea that if you use very minute amounts of a substance, diluted to a millionth or less of it in a solution, actually quite a lot less than that. It has the power to actually act as a like a drug as to cure specific problems. And it's this idea as well of curing like with like. So, for example, the most extreme cases here, we had a naturopathic practitioner here in British Columbia who was taken to court over an issue that they were actually promoting to I think it was a 2-year-old boy who had behavioral problems, who was particularly aggressive. And so they believed that the best way to cure that was actually to get rabid dog saliva from mad dogs, actually dilute it millions of times, and then give them a solution of this to cure their behavior. And of course, it's total faith-based nonsense. There are other more extreme examples. There's even ones of for separation anxiety using diluted parts of the Berlin Wall. So don't get me started on all of the different crazy homeopathic remedies. But the main problem with it is the dilutions they're using are actually so minor that there is actually nothing left of the original substance in the remedy. And for example, I'll give you an example. If we took a sphere of water that stretched between the earth and the sun, and looked at the typical dilution that was used in a homeopathic remedy, that sphere of water would contain 1 molecule of the substance in a typical homeopathic. So what you're actually buying is water.
And somehow there's an inverse relationship between dilution and strength, which we all learn.
That's their
Go ahead.
That's their argument. Yes, exactly. That's their argument. And so their argument is it's actually not the chemistry that causes it. It's actually things like memory or energy that's transferred. But of course, none of this makes any sense, because if you think about that, then your tap water would have the energy of all the things that have ever been in the tap water. So it's quite ludicrous, but yet here we are. It's marketed, and it's a multi-million-dollar industry.
Well, I challenge homeopaths to fill their gas tanks up with homeopathic fuel and see how far they get. Nobody will do that. It's the same theory, right? But there are countries where homeopathy is widespread, yet they still have the same high rates of disease that homeopathy is supposed to control. So how do homeopaths explain it?
Exactly. So, I mean, they don't. And also, there's been, aside from that, there's been a ton of research done on homeopathy over the years because it has been so popular. And what we tend to find is that the actual good quality research, when we talk to levels of evidence, very good quality, rigorous scientific studies, demonstrate it doesn't work. There's no difference between that and placebo. However, strangely enough, all the studies that the homeopaths do and publish in what we'd call very low quality journals or marketing materials all show it does work. So you can draw your own conclusions from that.
All right, let's move on to energy medicine. This is another favorite of mine because it's another mysterious thing. So this includes Reiki, or Reiki, however you say it, therapeutic touch. It's touchless healing. So it's true wizardry. What's with the rise of that?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. And when I first moved to Canada, I went into a local hospital for a conference where I was speaking. And in the interval, they had therapeutic touch practitioners offering free sessions to members of the conference, which staggered me, because it is pure faith-based faith healing, really. This idea that we have spiritual energies that nobody can see, that cannot be measured, and that, but if you do a short, month course with these practitioners such as Reiki or therapeutic touch, you can magically find the way to detect them and manipulate them, and therefore sell your services to people as a therapeutic touch practitioner. So again, this is another faith-based practice, no evidence that it actually works. Lots of really bad quality, what we call fake evidence, that has been published to support it. And it's actually something that in my profession in nursing is particularly championed by a lot of nurses. So I have a big problem with that because it is purely deceptive.
I was going to ask you about that because I have seen it in nursing schools. I'm sorry, I don't go to nursing school, but I've seen advertisements that it's offered as CMEs, right? Continuing medical education credits, right? And it's available in hospitals, as you just said. So when you're confronted with that, I mean, your 35 years of experience, how do you, explain it in your own mind how this is getting into the institutions, and then how do you explain it to people that actually do it?
Well, yeah, it is tricky, and it's used in a local hospital here, a local palliative care hospital. In Delta here in British Columbia offers it as a service. I understand they're not paid, but and it's voluntary, but it's still advertised and promoted. So one of the issues is for me, we've done some research on this as well to look at what is the actual research that supports it, and it's very poor. And one of the problems is differentiation between particularly bad quality research, or which is really marketing for a particular product. And these are studies that are designed to prove it works, not studies to give it a fair test. And there's a lot of that in healthcare research, we find, particularly in alternative healthcare. We see it a lot with things like acupuncture, with chiropractic research, also with, as I say, therapeutic touch. And when we look at those studies, they're published in usually self-interest journals. So these are journals that are promoted by the industry or somehow subsidized by the industry, or basically journals that are out there to promote alternative health, rather than more objective journals. And secondly, we often see it's promoted and marketed by the very people who actually are seeking to make a profit out of it. A therapeutic touch is an interesting one because there was a high school student who did a study on it to see if therapeutic touch practitioners could differentiate between, test the energy field in people or where there weren't, and did a very simple science project that proved it didn't work. So the evidence is very clear, but obviously, as we just saw with homeopathy, the marketing of it is very different. And there's people who will market these things based on their own beliefs, and they're very strong beliefs that these things work, rather than what does the actual evidence tell us.
Okay, and before someone jumps on us and puts in the comments you can't prove something doesn't work, what you're saying there is that she found no evidence that it did work, right? There's a lack of evidence for it. In fact, it was nothing greater than chance, right? So
she found no evidence that the claims they made that they could detect these energies, because they basically, if you go to any therapeutic touch practitioner website, they'll tell you, for example, they can detect abnormalities in the energy flow around our body, this mystical energy, and then they can manipulate it to smooth it out, which will improve healing. Now, when they're claiming they can detect these energies, it's quite easy to do an experiment to say, well, can you detect an energy over, for example, a human hand or a rock if you can't see what it is? and they couldn't. So we can demonstrate the claims are incorrect. You're right. You can't proving something doesn't work is not what something science can do. But proving when someone makes claims that what they're actually claiming is correct is something we can do.
and with therapeutic touch or Reiki or that type of energy healing, I understand how people might feel better, but they're not going to get better, right? So they may feel better because someone is paying attention to them, and I'm sure these are very caring individuals that practice it. I mean, they must have to be. I guess they don't
Yeah.
have to be, but I'm assuming that it's a very personable experience when you get this done. But my thing is, there's a difference between feeling better and getting better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this is a problem with modern healthcare as well. It's, one of the biggest industries in the world. We're all invested in it. Everybody is a potential client, because we all have our healthcare interests and needs. And the modern healthcare systems are pretty awful experiences for most people. If you go in to, see a doctor, and they want to take blood, well, somebody's going to stick a needle in your arm and do unpleasant things. You may have to have therapies, usually, which are quite unpleasant, drugs that maybe have side effects, surgery, which is painful. The list goes on. And if you go into most sort of public health clinics, you're usually waiting around. They're not particularly pleasant environments. They're noisy. There's other people who are ill. It's not a positive experience for most people. Alternatively, if you go to a Reiki practitioner, it's like going into a spa. You've got pleasant music, beautiful surroundings, usually someone who's spending a lot of time talking to you. So all of these things impact your impressions of what's better and what's working for you. And this is why very often people do say, yeah, they have a good experience with these practitioners, and they usually do, compared to the biomedical healthcare system. But that doesn't mean it works any better.
All right, let's get to the big one. I'll call it the big one, acupuncture. Okay. Some call it theatrical placebo. Some call it a form of distraction therapy. There are lots of folk tales around acupuncture and thousands of published papers. So what's your research tell us?
Well, the research is quite clear on it, really, that it does work as a pain distraction therapy, but this is just simply by putting needles in people. So this idea that there are sort of energy flows around the body with specific acupuncture points that affect, those energy flows of, again, this is sort of a form of faith-based practice. There's no evidence of that at all. There's been no physiology ever discovered that there's any underlying, unlike every other process we understand about the body, there's no physiology that shows, there's particular energy flows or chakra points or any of this. However, we do know that if someone's in pain, and you can, particularly with chronic pain as well, if you tend to focus on one particular pain at a time. So if you put a needle in, when you've got a headache, you're not thinking about the pain in your knee, etc. Our minds work very much focused on pain in specific instances, which one we're concentrating on. So if you give someone another stimuli somewhere else in the body with a needle, then we can show that actually does distract, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's better than any other mechanism we have. So again, there's a lot of snake oil and nonsense about acupuncture, which is really just needling as a form of distractive therapy. And if we find the points around the body where it's most effective, they correspond to where the nervous system is. So where the nerves are, that you're likely to respond with, rather than putting a needle in somewhere where you haven't got a lot of nerves, so you can't actually feel it. So in terms of pain care, needling has been shown to be effective for some things as a particular type of therapy. But in terms of, if we look at, as it's portrayed in traditional Chinese medicine, this idea that there's the energy flows throughout the body and that you're targeting them and blocking them, no evidence of that at all. And trials generally show that it doesn't work any more effectively than other forms of pain control.
And it's mild pain we're talking to, right? So the folktales are around, I don't know, some Nixon-era appendicitis case and some open-heart surgery. And those are totally, when they're unpacked, it's totally bogus because, okay, so maybe they weren't under general anesthesia, but the patients had tons of sedatives and local anesthetics, right?
Yeah, I mean, and interestingly, a few years back, I was invited to an alternative medicine conference in China, and I don't know what they asked me, but they did, and I went, and I was talking then about our use of as a pain relieving measure, or using distraction with virtual reality. And one of the presenters there was one of the doctors who apparently used acupuncture for open heart surgery in the 1960s. And this was very much championed by the Chinese state at the time, because it was an attempt to show that traditional Chinese medicine was superior to Western, if you like, medicine or biomedicine. But this is a really interesting case, because they were all applauding this physician that had undertaken open heart surgery using acupuncture. But when you actually look at it, again, lots of smoke and mirrors. What they'd actually done is used masses of local anesthetic to around the chest first of all, so there wouldn't be any pain there. They trained the patient to actually breathe using diaphragmatic breathing, so that they could actually breathe during the process. And so acupuncture was a very minor part of the whole process, and yet that was their argument. Also, it's particularly barbaric to try and do any type of open surgery without a general anesthesia, because it's pretty traumatic, obviously, if someone's soaring into your sternum and you're still awake. So lots of issues with it. But again, a lot of these tales about the success of acupuncture and the power of it are myths. They're not actually based in any type of actual events or research.
But they do have literally thousands of published papers. And I mean, probably most, if not all of them, report positive findings. But I mean, obviously I haven't read all of them, but I have read several, because it's interesting. They're working into like JAMA publications. But when you start to read these papers, they have fatal flaws, like sometimes right in the first few paragraphs. No study is perfect, But the acupuncture studies and the well, I don't know. You want to comment on how they design their studies, or?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, a lot of this is designed around what we call confirmatory studies. So these are studies, I can design a study that will prove any therapy works if you want me to. That's not how science works. Science actually works to, we set out a hypothesis that something works or not, and then we devise a rigorous, fair test of whether this particular therapy works or not. So a lot of these studies, for example, use sampling, where they target particular samples of people that are going to respond positively. There's all sorts of ways to introduce bias. And there's actually a very good site that gives a catalogue of bias at Oxford University, run by a colleague of mine, and that basically lists all these different types of bias you can introduce into studies. Now, if you design a study with those biases inherent in them, you can prove anything you want rather than give a fair test. And then there's the issue of where we publish these results. So there's this rise now in academic healthcare publications, what we call predatory publishing, and these are where journals are set up purely for the purpose of making large profits rather than disseminating scientific information. So these will actually go out and target professors. I get literally 20 or 30 emails a day from various journals asking me to publish with them. And there's a fee for publishing. So I'll get asked, if you publish with us, we'll publish your paper on, virtual reality and pain very quickly. It'll get reviewed within 2 weeks. It's a $2,000 fee and we'll publish. So there's great incentive to publish studies that are pretty meaningless and not really good quality studies. However, as I've said, there is evidence that acupuncture does work as a form of pain control for some particular conditions. And like I say, most of the science behind this would suggest it works particularly as some type of distraction rather than any other method. So it has some value, but then again, it can be hyped up to ridiculous levels about how it works and what it actually can achieve through the practitioners publishing in these sorts of journals.
All right, one more example at least here. What I'll call one-stop shopping for all things alternative medicine, maybe the true Wizard of Oz, and of course that has to be naturopathy. As far as alternative medicine goes, naturopathy, they go to great lengths to try and dress up like real medicine. So can you talk about that? How do they acquire the trappings of medicine, and yet also why it can kind of be dismissed as pretend medicine, if I'm not being too blunt? You can.
Yeah, naturopathic practitioners are particularly problematic because they spend a lot of money to get their doctorates. And these are in private universities in Canada, anyway. And in most parts of the world, they're private colleges that supply these qualifications. And they're really they're a mix because they do some study of biomedicine in their early years, but then they do loads of other stuff like particularly homeopathy. It's a major part of the curriculum, and we know how homeopathy is complete bunk, but yet they'll spend more time studying that than they will studying chemistry and pharmacology. And there's again a strong reliance on this idea that the naturalistic fallacy we mentioned earlier, that natural is better, and we know that isn't the case. Often things that are natural are actually pretty toxic for us if we're not careful. But yet when they're qualified, the weird thing is they start then marketing all sorts of therapies basically to make a living that have nothing to do with natural remedies. And I'll give you an example here that's a trend. It's possibly a trend in your part of the world, but it's certainly a trend here in Vancouver and in Canada. And that's IV clinics that are popping up run by naturopaths. And these are clinics where you can pay to go in and get an intravenous infusion of large doses of vitamins, or what they call chemical cocktails of vitamins and nutrients in large numbers, delivered over a half an hour in an IV that are designed to make you feel better. Well, an IV is the opposite of any natural therapy. An IV involves sticking a needle into your circulatory system, into a vein, which is naturally protected under the skin and several layers of tissue, so that you cannot access it naturally. It's something you have to do with an artificial means. And secondly, it involves introducing large volumes of substances into the bloodstream that it would never naturally have in them, which again are excreted by, as a nephrology nurse of the past, I can tell you they're excreted from the body in probably about 3 to 5 minutes. So, whenever you go for a wee. So it's literally not doing anything. And also the evidence, there's been research on this because it was thought at one time that large doses of vitamins might be actually beneficial, for example, in the treatment of cancer. But the research showed it didn't work. As I say, these substances are excreted rapidly, and they have no real benefit apart from lightening your wallet. So, naturopaths are engaged in. I could give you a range of other examples of this, but there's a huge amount of these sorts of activities they engage in, and they've got no good evidence. They're not evidence-based practices. They're faith-based practices, and also based on very weak studies that are often years old and discredited.
Well, when I say it's one-stop shopping, I mean, you've touched on some, but homeopathy, acupuncture, the detox stuff, the energy healing we talked about, that's all part of their stuff. But isn't one of their main thrusts that the vitalism, I think you talked about that's the life force, right? But then the four,
Yeah.
isn't it also, aren't they still stuck with the four humors that all disease is caused by an imbalance in blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile? Is that the naturopath thing?
It depends which school you go to. I mean,
Oh,
there's no
really?
universal
Oh,
curriculum. Vitalism is, yeah, part of their core belief set. And again, if we go back and look at the actual roots of naturopathy, it's basically derived in a lot of spiritualism and nonsense that basically we know is not correct. So again, these are faith-based practices, but there is no standard curriculum. So what you'll get in one school to another is completely different. And I've met some naturopaths who are really smart people, and there's some of them have rebelled against it. Their education, and so they have moved on, and but there's an awful lot out there who've gone to be frank, quite Mickey Mouse schools and got a qualification and are now practicing.
yeah. So people might be confused though, because I mean, as you said, they pay a lot of money for this. They can claim an education because they spent years studying it, right? Sometimes it's in this intense training, and they can point to all these evidence-based positive trials that you say, they're not science-based. So they can say, listen, I'm educated. I've got my 4 years. I got my 5 years in here. I wear a white lab coat. And so they actually, this is the part about deception I want to talk about. They probably are deceiving themselves too, right? So it's not, there's the deception of the public, but also they have to be in some kind of self-deception. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and this is very much an issue across the board with what we see in terms of healthcare deception and practitioners. Um, it's hard to single out a particular profession because the medical professions are guilty of this as well. Particularly with practitioners, we see this what we call a savior or white knight syndrome. Now, everybody who goes into healthcare generally has a genuine wish to help people, because otherwise we wouldn't do it. It's not a pleasant activity to be involved around people who are ill or sick or suffering. So the people have got altruistic ideals to go into healthcare professions. But we do see an extreme of this at a high level where you get these, as I say, these white knight syndrome, where the person has a compulsive need to help or rescue or fix other people. They have an extreme need to be viewed as important or unique. In that they've got an ability to fix you that nobody else has. They believe their skills are particular to answering other people's health problems, and no one else can do that. They identify unusual and novel techniques very often as well, and often offer unsolicited advice or seek praise for these. And we see this a lot in the nutraceutical industry, where these practitioners are really pushing that. And when challenged, they often profess political or conspiracy theories against them. In fact, I'll give you an example. When my book came out, I had an MD called Randy Tobler emailed me saying that basically he has got a nutraceutical site where he sells various products. and suggesting that I needed to man up and have a conversation with him because I was frightened of the truth of the matter, and that I was basically some sort of conspiracy theorist. I actually said the word that time, a conspiracy theorist who is out to hide the truth. So this sort of nonsense goes on in medicine as well as alternative medicine.
So it's one thing to have a acupuncture training center. I don't know what they call it, if they have their own college, but naturopaths, they have their own colleges. So it's one thing for them to promote their beliefs. All right. But there are college and university systems that also offer classes, and I'm talking state universities, other private colleges that aren't dedicated just to naturopath and alternative medicine. But some schools offer classes in alternative medicine, and they should know better. I've talked to people in psychology departments that they want to criticize their own school for offering acupuncture, but they've been told not to, and things like that. So isn't the higher education system supposed to be like the guard at the gate? So what's the deal with that? Is it just profit or business model over truth? I mean, is that too cynical?
Probably not these days. The things have moved in a way that a lot of in higher education and academia, where I work, is basically focused on the financial side of things. So they are profitable. So, for example, there's a local college here in British Columbia that did for a while offer a therapeutic touch course, and this was a state-funded college, and I'd actually complained about it, but to the governing authorities, but the response of the dean was, "Well, actually recruits and makes us money, and you can't prove it doesn't work." So that's their view, and it varies on the level of institution. And you will find most top level institutions don't, for example, offer programs of naturopathy or chiropractic or things like that. But there are a lot of them that do offer, courses. A lot of nursing schools, for example, will offer courses in alternative healthcare, and rather than giving an objective view of it, they're actually promoting faith-based practices. But that goes back to a lot of the roots of nursing comes from faith-based, institutions with nuns and things like that. So we've got a long history of that sort of thing in nursing. But in medicine as well, we see that. And as I say, if you look at, for example, universities nowadays, they're very focused on the bottom line. A lot of their profits come from selling courses to international students, where the fees are larger, and they've just clamped down on that in British Columbia, where I work. But a lot of it is based, unfortunately, on financial issues rather than necessarily good science.
Here's something I'm not sure about Canada, and if it's in your book, I apologize. I did read the whole thing, but it's a particular problem down here in the States is that beyond their schools and other universities bringing it on board for profit, a lot of alt med practitioners, such as naturopaths, chiropractors, maybe acupuncturists, they've successfully lobbied state legislators to allow them to form their own regulating committees or boards or authorities or registries, whatever they want. So they look even more like real doctors. And I know this is a case because in Massachusetts, just a few years back, we had a proposal. It was an act establishing a board of registry in naturopathy. And it passed, and the governor signed it. And I was stunned as it went through this process because I thought, this is never going to get through. So what's up with that? I mean, entire governments are getting duped now.
Yeah, well, exactly, and it's been an issue that I've raised over the years, and it is mentioned in the book. One of the particular issues is regulation, and the fact that most healthcare regulation is actually focused nowadays on popularism and political theory of positions rather than good science and evidence. So if there's a large portion of the population, for example, that believes in traditional Chinese medicine, then the local government is going to be pressured to offer courses and degrees in traditional Chinese medicine, which has actually just happened here in British Columbia. So we see this all over the world, where populist pressure is applied, and then politicians who generally don't know a lot about healthcare science will react to what their local populations are pushing for. And so if there's a case to be made that, it'll gain them votes and it'll be popular in the local population if we offer a particular qualification, then they'll do that and they'll regulate to do that. So again, if you look at healthcare regulation, it is a big problem area because a lot of healthcare regulation is not based on good science and what we know works and doesn't. It's based on a mix of science-based practices and also faith-based practices that are supported by local communities.
Let me mention one other thing. Probably about the same time, the Veterans Administration down here in the States, I think it was Directive 1187, but don't quote me on that. I don't know why I know that. But so this directive issued that that Reiki, reflexology, acupuncture, therapeutic touch, healing touch, and other alt meds be included in veterans' medical benefits practices, right? So that's part of their hospital system now. They have to offer it. It's a directive. So
Yeah.
with state and federal agencies having these registries and directives, it's kind of a circular reasoning, right? Because naturopaths or whatever, they fight for approval, and then they get their registry and approval, and then they can use that as tacit acknowledgement that, look, see, it works because now we're government registry, right? Does that make any?
Absolutely. Yeah, and it validates
Oh, that's
the
it. The
profession.
validates.
And then, yeah, and they use that all the time. As I say, if a hospital employs a therapeutic practitioner to come in, even if it's for free, it validates that that's a practice, a valid healthcare practice. When, of course, the evidence shows it doesn't work. It's a big problem. And it's one that, if we look at healthcare regulation, it has become pretty much the Wild West in a lot of, anything goes in terms of which practices are supported and regulated. And allowing these practitioners to self-regulate themselves is just opening the floodgate doors because you're allowing people to basically practice magical remedies and licensing them to do it.
Besides generalized things like naturopathy, acupuncture, there are specialized scams as well. And a big one is cancer clinics you speak about.
Yeah, absolutely. There's two I know of in the States, and there's more that operate there. There's the Brzezinski Clinic, which is a clinic that suggests that that they can cure cancer with these particular proteins called anti-neoplastons, and that Dr. Brzezinski has developed. And basically, the evidence is that they don't work at all, and yet they have a regular turnover of clients and $1 million industry, clinic that is making a lot of money out of that. And there's the Hippocrates Health Institute, which is in Florida, and that's run by Brian Clements and his wife, Anna Maria Clements. Both have been named in several separate lawsuits in Palm Beach, claiming that they have natural remedies for cancer. And again, no evidence that they actually work any better. So these are basically what we'd call fake cancer clinics, in my opinion. And yet they're running for profits, and often people crowdsource to send their relatives or send their sick child there because medicine hasn't been able to offer a solution to or an unpleasant solution to treating cancer. Because let's face it, treating cancer is awful. You've got chemotherapy, radiotherapy, etc., all very invasive and therapies with huge side effects. So when someone offers you hey, we've got a cure that's really natural and works, there's a strong emphasis to believe that and hope that's going to cure.
Setting aside the cancer clinics for just a second, all right, because there's obvious harm there, okay? But other people could dismiss most of this conversation about naturopaths, acupuncture, Reiki. Like, what's the harm? Let people think what they want, right? So what do you say to that?
Yeah, and it's a common argument. The problem is that it is there are harms involved. For example, it gives people false hope when we know that these therapies they're selling aren't going to actually make any difference. Two, there's the financial harm. There's a list of harms, and again, we did research on this into harmful health practices, alternative healthcare practices, or risk-associated healthcare practices. There may be risk of injury. For example, the IV clinics I mentioned. There's a severe risk associated with any IV that you might contaminate the bloodstream and cause sepsis, or using various drugs in high volumes may be fatal, and there have been fatalities. So there are risks associated with that as well. And then lastly, there's this idea that what you're actually doing by risk in promoting activities in health interventions, drugs, healthcare practices that don't actually work, you're wasting a huge amount of dollars then into research into these things, which could be spent on things that actually do work and that are more likely to work, rather than just burning money trying to prove homeopathy is actually works.
All right, let's kind of sum this up now. So let me ask you, how can this be cleaned up? So if they seem to get legislative approval and regulations, is this a matter of individual consumer education and buyer beware? Or because once you have a registry of naturopaths, that's a state registration, good luck on doing that.
Yeah, exactly. So it's become more problematic, particularly with the open access to free markets. And I know there's a strong desire for not to have federal control or government control over healthcare practices. But there are two areas I'd say we can do things that can actually improve and add solutions to these issues. First of all, in education. We need to focus, for example, modern higher education systems on better focus on critical and scientific thinking and scientific reasoning throughout. That's sort of dropped out of a lot of healthcare practice professional degrees, simply because of the volume of content that we have to actually cover now. So curricular thread on what we call criticality, critical reasoning is really important. Explicitly teach about bad science, deceptive healthcare practices, and the psychology of persuasion. Those things are really important in healthcare, and understanding, what is good and bad science, what is pseudoscience, what deceptive healthcare practices are, like the ones we've discussed today, and how people can be persuaded can help people understand and recognize this. And also look at research methods courses that focus on avoiding confirmatory study design. So recognizing deceptive studies and particularly avoiding predatory and what we call vanity publishing and fake data. So all of those things can be put into the curriculum to help people better understand this problem. And then on the regulatory side, well, we do need better regulatory control of advertising standards. There's absolute nonsense on any time you go on YouTube now. If you go and watch a YouTube video, you'll get bombarded with ridiculous health adverts saying, that if you do chair yoga, you'll look like Arnold Schwarzenegger in 2 weeks, and these sort of things. Stop the accreditation of bogus health degrees and doctorates. That really is a problem area. Improve professional codes and standards so that people who do actually go foul of the standards are actually disciplined. Being a healthcare professional is a privilege. It's something that you should lose if you're shown to be marketing fake remedies or for profit. And there's plenty of practitioners that have been actually prosecuted for doing that, including Dr. Oz, who's now an advisor for President Trump's health plans. So removing problem practitioners from practice early, stop self-regulation of alternative health professions, and improve public oversight. All of these things can be done and would certainly improve the situation.
All right. We'll hope for the best. Dr. Bernie Garrett, thanks so much for being here. Your book, once again, it is The New Alchemists, The Rise of Deceptive Healthcare. There's a lot of information in the book. It's a great read. You also have this risk of deception tool to help people evaluate claims. By the way, it's a free tool. This is not an advertisement. It's like an algorithm or a flow chart you can use. It's in the book, but I imagine if you must have it online somewhere as well.
It is. There's a link to it in the book, but you can, if you just Google my name as well, you'll find links to it on my website, on my university website, and it's a free tool anyone can use. Yeah.
Dr. Bernie Garrett, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks for your interest. Bye-bye.
You're welcome.